Hello, I'm Jan Szrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're talking about Russia's lack of economic and political isolation. After Vladimir Putin decided that invading Ukraine in 2022 would be a fantastic idea, like using a flamethrower as a toaster, everyone assumed that within a few months, Russia would be as isolated as a rabid raccoon in a petting zoo. Except, it's not. In fact, nearly 3 years after the full-scale invasion, Russia remains frustratingly unostracized. When the invasion began, Western leaders thought, we've got this. We'll just slap sanctions on Russia like stickers on a middle schooler's laptop. But it takes more than sanctions to isolate an economy, or a state for that matter. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report.
Since the onset of the war in Ukraine, the West has virtually cut all ties with Russia, striving to isolate the country. Recently, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov argued that these efforts have been unsuccessful, pointing to the strengthening of ties between Russia and countries in the global South and East.
The process of building a new security architecture is well underway, which is no longer based on the Euro-Atlantic concept, but on the understanding that the united Eurasian continent is now creating opportunities for everyone to equally safeguard the interests of each other.
To a certain extent, Lavrov is right that isolating Russia failed. After all, he made this comment during the recent OSCE meeting held in EU member state Malta, marking Lavrov's first visit to the bloc since the onset of the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin also enjoys trips abroad and high-level meetings with world leaders. The most recent notable gathering was the 16th BRICS summit, where the Russian president attempted to challenge Russia's isolation.
They do not hide the goal of inflicting a strategic defeat on our country at all. I will say bluntly that these are illusory goals that can only be made by those who do not know the history of Russia.
While attempts to isolate Russia have certainly impacted the country's economy, it also pushes Moscow to seek alternatives and strengthen ties with whoever is willing.
And now it's time to examine the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. The global community has more moral flexibility than people now have when cheering on the healthcare CEO killer. Russia still trades. Russia still invests. Russia still finds new ways to get those precious car parts, luxury goodies, and, oh yes, the little bits and bobs for their military-industrial complex. And why is that so? Well, because certain countries are saying, isolation? Nah, that's just too harsh. Besides, I can make a nice buck playing the middleman here. China's right there, rolling up its sleeves and saying, we've got you, buddy. Need a new market for your discounted commodities? Step right up. India, the UAE, Brazil, they're all strolling into the Russian marketplace, baskets on their arms, humming, a deal's a deal. And international clubs like BRICS, not only are they still functioning, they are growing. Now, from an economic standpoint, sanctions are a form of protectionism, barriers meant to disrupt the free flow of goods. But the thing is, wherever there is a barrier, there is an opportunity. It's like your parents saying, no more chocolate. Suddenly, a kid from the house next door may just show up whispering, I've got Twix at half price. That's arbitrage, exploiting price differences and restrictions. The more the West tries to isolate Russia, the bigger the profit margins for crafty intermediaries. Markets like water, they find the cracks. And right now, Russia's cracks are basically wide open floodgates. Turkey and the UAE have become transit hubs. Sanctions? Sure, we'll follow them. Just let us check if that shipment of discounted caviar and engine parts has cleared customs first. That's what they seem to be saying. Chinese automakers are having a field day. Western car companies have left Russia, so China said, our turn. And now Russia's their biggest market. The result? Russia's economy gets beaten up a bit, sure, but it's still standing, supported by a patchwork of global partners who see isolation not as a principle, but as a profit-making puzzle. And what about the credibility problem that the West is hoping would plague Russia like an epidemic of trust issues? In the West's eyes, Russia's like that friend who promises to feed your cat and then sets your apartment on fire. Untrustworthy doesn't even cover it. Ultimately, I think we have learned the hard way that economic and political isolation isn't a straightforward recipe where you just add sanctions and stir. Ironically, the best shot at isolating Russia might be Russia itself. After all, self-isolation might just be the final act in this tragic geopolitical circus. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bartłomiej Kot, Program Director at the Warsaw Security Forum. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me.
So, when thinking about the sanctions that should have worked but actually did not, which of those is the most aggravating from our Western perspective?
Well, honestly speaking, when you look at the response to the Russia's activity in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine, the response has always been based on the issue of solidarity. And from the political point of view, throughout this duration of this war, the political solidarity and stability of the West has always been actually questioned. Even from the early beginning, there was no like a stable coalition of the countries that univocally actually supported sanctions. Look at Hungary, for example. From the very beginning, there was always at least one country that was undermining the European effort.
So it was stable in that it was not changing, but it did have outliers like Hungary, later on Slovakia. It's dependent on the democratic processes,
Of
right?
course, I mean, to a certain degree, it does. I mean, when you look at the European Union, there has to be, of course, the support of all the European countries. Of course, there were some ambitions when it comes to the countries that from the early beginning they stated that support to Ukraine as long as it takes and with all that is actually there in stocks, and also when it comes to the sanctions regime, is the most important, is the priority of the foreign policy. But even among the European countries, the division on how this war should actually end has always been in question. I mean, I know that throughout the months of this war, throughout years of this war, we have always been, saying that Europe stands strong behind Ukraine. But right now, when we look at we are in this war, let's be honest. Even from the early beginning, there has always been some kind of the negotiation taking place between the European countries when it comes to what kind of support, how fast, and to what extent there should be for Ukraine. And I can afford being critical right now because I can see that actually this tear-dropping support to Ukraine also brought us to the point in this war where we are here right now, when we have to resolve the whole situation through the negotiations, through diplomatic talks, rather than through actually the full-scale victory.
So it's military drip feeding, right? But coming back to the question of political support, you've mentioned that overall, one could say that there has been a group of countries such as the United States, most of the European Union, who have been standing with Ukraine for pretty much most of the time. But just as this majority has been a stable one, there has also been a stable lack of uniform support in the global south. Why do you think that is so? And should we, Europeans basically, be angry about the global south that it does not follow our line of thinking? Or should we perhaps try to see beyond our viewpoint? Because it's about the economy, but it's also about the mentality, it's about the political culture of these countries, and they have a right to have a different political culture than we do.
Certainly, yeah. But I would even put it in a broader context. US, the Western Europe, has always perceived this war as a protection of the internationally recognized rules, international world order that is based on rules. In my opinion, at least, this perception that is, of course, in line with our interests, because this is the world order that was established firstly after 1945 and then extended in 1989. It was with, of course, in favor of our way of thinking about the world, what kind of interest that we want to project. Among the global south, we have seen throughout the last at least 25 years period some new powers emerging that not necessarily perceive this world order as the one that actually speaks to their interests. Look at India. Look at China. Those are the countries that are right now the global economies, the global powers to some degree. India is the rising power, of course. That not necessarily think that our perception of the world is the one that they want to subscribe to. And if we consider this war as the war of protection of our world order, then of course the global south, the powers of the global south consider this war as a matter of fact as something that can change this world order into their own interest. So
it's a revisionist perspective to some extent.
Yes, but undermining the world order that is based on the hegemony of the U.S., on the hegemony of the Western civilization, that is democracy, that is internationally recognized borders and things like that. Is sometimes in the interest of these countries. And we, from the early beginning of this war, have actually repeatedly said that it is something that the whole world subscribes to, not necessarily, unfortunately. The souther you get, the more you understand that they see this war as the rather a place where the interests of global powers that they come into the question, and not necessarily as a war of protection of the rules as they stand also for them, as they're interested to protect them.
Right, so there are a couple of things here. We often tend to say, oh, these countries are just being cynical. They stand to benefit economically from Russia's presence on the international arena, even from its plight. I mean, Russia is forced to buy products, for example, at disadvantageous conditions that it wouldn't have bought or wouldn't have sold, for that matter, if it wasn't in a state of war. But there is also another issue. The global south often says it's not just Russia that has been fighting unjust wars, and they often point the finger at America. They point the finger at Iraq, for example, so as not to go too far back into the past. Do they have a point in this regard, accusing the US of being slightly hypocritical here?
It all depends on the question. If you pose it as the primary question to all of that, whether you can conduct wars in defense of some values that you treat as the most important ones. If the values that our civilization, the Western civilization, stands for, are worth fighting wars for, then I assume that it is worth actually doing that. Sorry to say so. Of course,
Ukraine's war is a just war. It's defending itself.
It is a just war.
But what about Iraq? Was that a just war? Depends who you ask, really.
Well, of course, it depends who you ask. Right now, even in the U.S., even among the Republicans, you have, of course, the people contest the view that there were actually evidences that allowed for this war to happen. But in the end, we got rid of a dictator that conducted mass murders. So
now we ended with chaos for a long time.
That is a matter of actually the way the whole thing was governed later on. But you cannot say that the cost for the war was unjust. It was a just cost to get rid of a dictator who conducted mass murders and who was the destabilizator in the region.
Well, that's a compelling point. But it has given Russia the framework for creating an argument that, oh, they might be brewing weapons of mass destruction there. We need to act. I mean, this narrative, even though it was absurd in the case of Ukraine, was taken straight out of the Bush administration playbook to some extent.
The issue with Russia is that they're using a lot of arguments that the West projects in order to justify the Western conduct, the Western actions, and they treat it as a justification of their own. But without actually they take them very literally, without mimicking what I would consider the same values that stand for these actions.
No, of course, they're exploiting it cynically.
Long story short, it's not about the arguments you put on the table, because in the end it is a political narrative that you also have to, of course, sell to your electorate, you have to sell to your partners, you have to even sell to your adversaries or enemies. The question is whether the conduct of your action, you consider that just from the point of view of your interest. If you want to say that the West is cynical in conducting some actions, for example, in support of Ukraine or in support of democratic movements in the Arab world, that's okay. Well, from the point of view, you can be cynical in conducting politics. That's maybe some would say that this is actually the nature of the politics. But in the end, I would prefer a country that stands for its own, that has the possibility to choose the alliances, that live in a prosperous world, and that lives in the system that protects human rights. And all of that is actually something that only the West can offer and only the Western civilization can offer to these countries. So from this point of view, I consider the whole actions of the West as just causes, simply speaking. Of course, the arguments that are raised by Russians, that are raised right now also by the global South, they sound cynical. They have also their own, of course, interests. I wouldn't criticize them on the nature of cynicism. I would only say that these are the interests of these countries. We don't have to agree with them, simply speaking. But as a matter of fact, and that would be my line, I prefer a prosperous country that is governed by human rights and that has the ability to choose its own alliances. And this is what the West actually offers.
No, of course, I was just mentioning this just to emphasize that these arguments that we're presenting, they might not be entirely watertight. And one very quick last question. Would you say that we're doing enough to engage with the global South in order to present our view? Because there's also the question of post-colonial past, and the problem is that Russia is using a completely cynical narrative in that it presents itself as being anti-colonial, which it is not.
Certainly it is not. The West has the post-colonial history. Russia has the colonial history that is happening still right now. And that's a huge difference that I suppose a lot of the Western politicians should underline when they talk with the countries from the global South. Of course, we have some shadows, some bad histories from the past that we have to overcome, but we are doing that. This is a whole discussion that is taking place right now in the West. And a country such as Poland that doesn't have actually the colonial past can and is a part of the Western world can actually help in being the bridge between the Western world and the global South, for which I hope and this is our actually advantage over countries such as Russia that is still conducting the imperialistic and colonial activities.
And that is an excellent point. Bartłomiej Kot was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us. And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. A recent poll has shown that Ukraine is the most Trump-positive nation in Europe. This surprising finding comes amid declining trust in Western leadership and a major shift in Ukrainian public opinion towards self-reliance in defense.
A new poll by the New Europe Center has revealed that Donald Trump is the 10th most trusted foreign leader in Ukraine, with a trust rating of 44%. This makes Ukraine the most Trump-positive nation in Europe, surpassing even Hungary, where Trump is trusted by 37% of the population. In contrast, his ratings are significantly lower in Western Europe, standing at 16% in France and 30% in the UK. The findings are unexpected given Trump's previous harsh rhetoric towards Ukraine, including threats to cut aid and plans to negotiate a deal with Russia. However, the declining popularity of President Joe Biden in Ukraine, whose approval rating has dropped from 81% to 55%, may provide some context. Yet another survey by the New Europe Center highlights a shift in Ukrainian public opinion regarding security. The poll showed that 31% of Ukrainians now view developing nuclear weapons as their best security guarantee, slightly ahead of NATO membership at 29%. This marks a dramatic change from last year, when support for NATO membership was higher at 32%.
Ukraine has revealed that volunteers from over 70 countries are currently serving in its armed forces, helping to combat Russian troops on the front lines. With the war soon reaching a 3-year mark, the interest in joining the Ukrainian Legion of Volunteers is not dropping.
The Ukrainian Legion of Volunteers is a military unit composed of foreign nationals who have volunteered to fight for Ukraine. It was formed in response to Russia's all-out war against Ukraine, allowing non-Ukrainian citizens to join Kiev's armed forces to defend the country. Currently, soldiers from 72 countries are serving in the unit, with 40% hailing from South America. With the war approaching its 4th year, the interest is not dropping, as between 400 and 600 foreign recruits join the Ukrainian military each month. According to Ukraine's armed forces, the motivations of foreign volunteers vary, ranging from financial incentives and gaining experience to seeking challenges, Ukrainian citizenship, and a deep-seated hatred for Russia. Despite their diverse reasons for joining, Ukraine's military emphasizes that the quality of service among foreign volunteers is on par with that of Ukrainian soldiers.
As Russia plummets into a demographic crisis, Moscow is proposing financial incentives to female students for giving birth. Although the sum might not be impressive, Vladimir Putin believes this will help reverse the aging of Russian population.
Starting January 1st, 2025, at least 11 Russian regions will offer female students 100,000 rubles, the equivalent of almost $1,000, for giving birth, as part of President Vladimir Putin's efforts to address the country's demographic crisis. The incentives are aimed at full-time students. However, the birth of a stillborn child is not covered under these bonuses. This policy comes amid growing concerns over reproductive rights in Russia, where women face increasing pressure to have more children. Authorities have labeled child-free lifestyles as an extremist ideology, outlawed coercion into abortion, and extended federal state maternity payments. President Putin has emphasized the importance of larger families, advocating for families with 3 or more children to become the norm. This push comes as Russia's birth rate has dropped to its lowest level in 25 years, while mortality rates continue to rise.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.